The morning sun cast long shadows across the Eurasian steppe as Temujin watched his warriors return from their latest raid. Behind them, a column of captives stumbled through the dust, their faces etched with the kind of despair that comes from witnessing everything familiar torn away in a single day. Among them were dozens of women, some barely more than children, others mothers who had watched their families slaughtered just hours before. What awaited these women wasn't simply slavery as other civilizations understood it. It was something far more calculated, more systematic, and infinitely more devastating. This was the birth of the most efficient human processing machine in history, and these captives were about to become its first test subjects. If you're fascinated by the darker chapters of human history, the moments when empires reveal their true cost in blood and suffering, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because what we're about to explore didn't happen in some distant, abstract past. It happened to real people, in real places, across a continent-spanning network of cruelty that makes other historical atrocities look almost quaint by comparison. Today we're diving deep into one of history's most disturbing success stories. The Mongol Empire didn't just conquer territory, they revolutionized the very concept of human exploitation, turning captive women into the fuel that powered their unprecedented expansion across the known world. What they created wasn't random violence or chaotic brutality. It was organized, systematic, and terrifyingly effective. The year was 1206 when Temujin officially became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. But his transformation from tribal chieftain to world conqueror had been brewing for decades, shaped by experiences that taught him the cold mathematics of power. As a young man, he had witnessed his own family's enslavement, watched his mother struggle to feed her children after his father's murder. These early lessons in vulnerability and strength would later manifest in policies that prioritized efficiency over mercy, utility over humanity. The Khan understood something that eluded other conquerors of his era. Victory wasn't just about defeating armies or capturing cities. True conquest required the complete transformation of conquered populations, breaking them down and rebuilding them as components of the Mongol machine. And at the center of this transformation were the women, whose bodies became both the symbols and instruments of Mongol dominance. When Mongol forces approached a settlement, they didn't simply attack and pillage like Viking raiders or medieval knights. They implemented a carefully orchestrated process that had been refined through countless campaigns. Scouts would identify key targets within the population long before the main force arrived. Who were the leaders? Where were the most valuable craftsmen? Which families had the most beautiful daughters? This intelligence gathering wasn't casual reconnaissance. It was systematic inventory taking, cataloging human resources for optimal exploitation. The actual conquest followed predictable patterns that became the Mongol trademark across 3 continents. Resistance meant annihilation. Surrender meant survival, but survival on Mongol terms that redefined the very meaning of human existence. When a city opened its gates without fighting, the population would be herded into open areas and sorted with the precision of merchants organizing merchandise at a market. The sorting process itself was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Children were separated from parents, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters. The elderly and infirm were eliminated immediately as useless mouths that would consume resources without providing value. Adult males faced execution unless they possessed skills the Mongols deemed essential. But the women faced something arguably worse than death. They faced complete erasure of everything they had ever been, followed by systematic reconstruction as Mongol property. Age determined fate with brutal clarity. Girls between 12 and 16 were considered prime acquisitions, young enough to be molded, but old enough to serve immediate purposes. Women in their 20s and 30s were evaluated based on their apparent health and breeding potential. Those showing signs of pregnancy often faced immediate termination of their condition, not from sadistic impulse, but from cold calculation. Pregnant slaves were less mobile, less useful for the grueling journeys ahead. The Khan's personal approach to captive women set the template for his entire empire. His collection of wives and concubines wasn't driven by passion or even political alliance in the traditional sense. It was genetic imperialism on a continental scale. Each woman represented a conquered people, her children destined to carry Mongol blood into territories that might resist purely foreign rule. Modern genetic analysis suggests this strategy succeeded beyond even Genghis Khan's wildest ambitions. His Y chromosome markers appear in roughly 16 million men alive today, a biological testament to systematic sexual conquest spanning generations. But the Khan's personal harem was just the visible peak of a massive pyramid of sexual slavery that extended throughout Mongol society. Every warrior, from the highest general to the lowest archer, expected his share of human plunder after successful campaigns. This wasn't considered a bonus or reward. It was standard compensation, as integral to Mongol military service as weapons or horses. Victory meant access to women, and that access was distributed according to strict hierarchies that reinforced the empire's social structure. The distribution process followed protocols as rigid as military formations. The most beautiful captives were reserved for commanders and tribal leaders. Skilled craftswomen might be allocated to households needing specific talents. The remainder were divided among common soldiers according to their rank and service record. Some women changed hands multiple times in a single day, as warriors traded them like gaming pieces or used them to settle debts and disputes. Transportation networks developed to move this human cargo across distances that stagger the imagination. Captive women seized in Polish villages might find themselves in Mongolian yurts within months, having traveled thousands of miles along trade routes that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. The logistics alone required organizational genius comparable to modern multinational corporations. Rest stations were established at regular intervals, stocked with supplies and guarded by troops specifically assigned to prevent escapes. The journey itself served as the first phase of psychological conditioning. Women were roped together in long chains, forced to march across hostile terrain with minimal food and water. Those who fell behind were abandoned or killed to prevent the convoys from slowing down. Survivors learned their first lesson in Mongol efficiency. Individual suffering was irrelevant compared to the smooth operation of the system. They were cargo now, and cargo that caused delays was simply discarded. Processing centers emerged at major crossroads throughout the empire, functioning as combination way stations and human conditioning facilities. Newly arrived captives were stripped, bathed, and examined for disease or disability. Those deemed suitable for manual labor were branded and assigned to work gangs. Those selected for sexual service underwent different preparation, cleaned and dressed according to Mongol preferences, their hair styled and their skin treated with oils that would make them more appealing to their eventual owners. The psychological techniques employed at these centers revealed sophisticated understanding of human behavior that wouldn't have been out of place in modern interrogation manuals. Captives were isolated from anyone who shared their language or cultural background, preventing the formation of mutual support networks. They were given new names that bore no relation to their former identities, often simple descriptive terms that reduced them to their most basic physical characteristics. The alternation between cruelty and unexpected kindness proved particularly effective at breaking down resistance. A woman might be severely beaten for speaking her native language one day, then rewarded with extra food or warmer clothing the next for demonstrating compliance. This unpredictability created emotional dependency and confusion, making captives grateful for any scrap of human decency while never knowing when the next punishment might fall. The Mongols also pioneered the use of captive women as tools for processing new arrivals. Broken women who had fully accepted their new circumstances were employed as translators and cultural interpreters, helping to sort fresh captives according to their backgrounds and potential uses. These collaborators, however unwilling their initial participation, became essential components of the system. Their intimate knowledge of conquered cultures, making them invaluable for identifying hidden nobles or locating concealed valuables. The breeding programs represented perhaps the most chilling aspect of Mongol innovation in human exploitation. This wasn't random sexual violence committed by undisciplined troops. It was systematic genetic engineering designed to create hybrid populations that would be culturally Mongol, but physically diverse enough to serve as administrators and intermediaries throughout the conquered territories. Beautiful women were specifically reserved for breeding with high-ranking Mongols, their children destined for positions of authority in the expanding empire. The scale of these operations defied comprehension even by the standards of other slaveholding societies. When Baghdad fell to Mongol forces in 1258, contemporary chroniclers reported that over 200,000 civilians were slaughtered in the space of a single week. But thousands more, primarily women and children, were loaded onto wagons and distributed to markets across the empire. Some went to slave bazaars in Samarkand, others to pleasure houses in Karakoram, still others to remote garrison towns where Mongol soldiers needed domestic servants and sexual companions. The empire's capital at Karakoram became a showcase of this human collection system. Visitors from across the known world marveling at the diversity of slaves on display. Blonde Russians worked alongside dark-skinned Arabs. Chinese artisans labored next to European peasants. It was multiculturalism achieved through conquest and coercion, a living museum of human subjugation that spanned continents and cultures. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Mongol approach was how thoroughly it succeeded in achieving its stated objectives. The systematic sexual exploitation of captive women wasn't a byproduct of conquest. It was conquest itself, the primary mechanism through which Mongol culture spread and took root in alien soil. Every child born from these forced unions represented another step in the empire's expansion, another link in chains that bound conquered peoples to their Mongol overlords through blood itself. The legal framework that developed around these practices revealed a sophistication that many historians prefer to ignore. Mongol law recognized different categories of human property, each with specific rights and restrictions. High-ranking captives might retain vestiges of their former status while serving diplomatic or administrative functions. Middle-tier prisoners became domestic servants or skilled workers. The lowest category, which included most captured women, were classified as a livestock, subject to the same regulations that governed horses and cattle. This wasn't primitive barbarism disguised as law. It was sophisticated jurisprudence applied to the systematic commodification of human beings. Mongol legal scholars developed detailed protocols governing everything from the punishment of disobedient slaves to the inheritance rights of mixed-blood children. They created vast bureaucracies devoted entirely to the administration of human property, complete with registries tracking ownership transfers, quality assessments, and productivity evaluations. The documentation that survived from these administrative systems reads like inventory lists from a livestock market. Women were catalogued by age, physical attributes, estimated reproductive capacity, and specialized skills. Transfer documents recorded their movement across thousands of miles with the same precision applied to silk shipments or horse breeding records. Deaths were noted as losses against projected returns. Births were recorded as additions to imperial assets. The psychological conditioning programs developed within this framework demonstrated an understanding of human behavior that wouldn't be equaled until the 20th century. Mongol administrators recognized that physical coercion alone produced unreliable results. True control required the systematic destruction of individual identity, followed by careful reconstruction, according to imperial specifications. This process began the moment captives arrived at processing facilities and continued for months or even years until the transformation was complete. New arrivals were immediately stripped of anything connecting them to their former lives. Names were replaced with numerical designations or simple descriptive terms. Native languages were forbidden under penalty of severe punishment. Religious practices were either banned entirely or corrupted into forms that reinforced rather than challenged their subjugation. Family bonds were deliberately severed through separation and redistribution, ensuring that no captive retained emotional connections that might inspire resistance. The replacement identity imposed on these women was carefully crafted to serve Mongol interests. They were taught rudimentary Mongolian phrases necessary for basic communication with their owners. They learned simplified versions of Mongol customs stripped of any elements that might foster cultural pride or independence. Most importantly, they were indoctrinated with absolute submission as not merely expected behavior but as their natural state of being. The training process itself varied depending on each woman's designated role within the empire. Those selected for domestic service learned household management techniques adapted to nomadic life. They mastered the care and maintenance of felt tents, the preparation of traditional Mongol foods, and the intricate social protocols governing interactions between different ranks within the tribal hierarchy. Their education was practical and focused, designed to produce efficient servants rather than thinking individuals. Women chosen for sexual service underwent different preparation that was both more intimate and more psychologically devastating. They were taught techniques for pleasing men who viewed them as objects rather than partners. They learned to suppress any expression of personal desire or preference, responding to their owner's wishes with enthusiasm regardless of their own feelings. Most cruelly, they were trained to compete with other women for their master's attention, turning potential allies into rivals and ensuring their continued isolation. The most intelligent captives faced perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Their mental abilities made them valuable as administrators and interpreters, but this value came at the cost of becoming active participants in their own people's oppression. These women were educated in Mongol law and administrative procedures, taught to read and write in scripts that would allow them to process documents and communications throughout the empire. They became the human machinery that kept the system running smoothly, their intimate knowledge of conquered cultures making them indispensable for identifying resistance networks and exploiting local weaknesses. The empire's expansion into Europe brought these refined techniques to populations that had never experienced systematic dehumanization on such a scale. The Mongol invasions of Poland and Hungary in 1241 introduced Western European societies to industrialized human trafficking for the first time in their history. Entire regions were depopulated as Mongol forces swept through, collecting every woman and child worth transporting, while leaving behind nothing but burned villages and mass graves. The psychological impact on European communities was profound and lasting. Chronicles from the period describe terror so complete that some towns committed mass suicide rather than face capture. Others abandoned their settlements entirely, fleeing deeper into forests and mountains in desperate attempts to avoid the Mongol processing system. The very knowledge that such systematic cruelty was possible fundamentally altered how these societies understood themselves and their place in the world. But the Mongols had calculated this reaction precisely. Terror wasn't a byproduct of their methods. It was the primary objective. Communities that surrendered without resistance received marginally better treatment than those that fought back. This created powerful incentives for collaboration and submission that rippled outward from each conquered territory, softening resistance for future campaigns and reducing the military resources needed for expansion. The intelligence networks that developed around captive women became one of the empire's most valuable strategic assets. Broken women who had been thoroughly conditioned were employed as interrogators and information gatherers, their shared experiences with new prisoners creating bonds of false sympathy that encouraged confession and cooperation. These human intelligence operations were so effective that they often eliminated the need for torture or extended questioning. Captives would reveal everything willingly to women they believed understood their suffering. The breeding programs reached their full development during the empire's golden age under Kublai Khan and his successors. By this period, the Mongols had refined their genetic engineering projects to an extraordinary degree of sophistication. Different bloodlines were carefully tracked and managed to produce offspring with specific desired characteristics. Children born from unions between Mongol men and Chinese women might be destined for administrative roles requiring cultural flexibility. Those with Persian mothers could serve as diplomatic intermediaries in Islamic territories. These hybrid children occupied a strange position within Mongol society, neither fully accepted as equals nor completely relegated to slave status. Their mixed heritage made them valuable as cultural bridges, but it also marked them as permanent outsiders in both of the worlds that had created them. Many struggled with profound identity conflicts that the Mongols exploited deliberately, using their psychological instability as another form of control mechanism. The economic implications of this human trafficking system extended far beyond simple labor exploitation. Captive women became a form of currency within the empire, traded between military units and used to settle debts or seal agreements. Their value fluctuated based on market conditions, just like any other commodity. Beautiful young women from exotic locations commanded premium prices, while older or less attractive captives might be exchanged for basic supplies or services. The empire's banking and credit systems incorporated human collateral as readily as they accepted gold or livestock. Merchants could secure loans against their slave holdings. Military commanders could mortgage their share of future captives to finance current campaigns. This financialization of human suffering created powerful economic incentives for continued expansion and conquest, as the entire system depended on a constant supply of fresh victims to maintain its profitability. The cultural destruction that accompanied these economic relationships was equally systematic and far more permanent. Languages died out as their last speakers were scattered across the empire and forbidden to teach them to their children. Artistic traditions vanished when their practitioners were reduced to producing crude utilitarian objects for Mongol households. Religious practices evolved into hollow rituals, stripped of their original meaning and power. Entire ethnic identities were dissolved into the Mongol melting pot, their distinctive characteristics diluted and eventually erased. The technological innovations that emerged from this system would influence human trafficking operations for centuries to come. The Mongols developed new methods for restraining and transporting large numbers of captives across vast distances. They created standardized processing procedures that could be implemented by administrators with minimal training. They pioneered psychological conditioning techniques that maximize compliance while minimizing resistance. These innovations spread throughout Eurasia as the empire fragmented, becoming part of the cultural DNA of successor states and trading networks. The documentation of these systems reveals a bureaucratic mindset that treated human suffering as a technical problem requiring optimal solutions. Mongol administrators kept detailed records of mortality rates during transport, experimenting with different feeding schedules and housing arrangements to maximize the number of slaves who survived their journeys. They tracked productivity metrics for different categories of workers, adjusting training programs and incentive structures to improve efficiency. They monitored breeding success rates, modifying selection criteria and care protocols to increase the yield of viable offspring. The scale and sophistication of these operations becomes clear when examining the empire's demographic impact on conquered territories. Genetic studies reveal the extent of Mongol sexual conquest with disturbing precision, showing how systematically the empire's breeding programs altered the biological composition of populations from Korea to Hungary. The Y chromosome signatures of Mongol warriors appear in millions of modern descendants, but they're accompanied by mitochondrial DNA patterns that tell the story of the women who bore their children under circumstances that can only be described as systematic rape on a continental scale. The empire's religious policies toward captive women revealed another layer of calculated psychological warfare that historians often overlook. The Mongols weren't simply religiously tolerant as many textbooks suggest. They weaponized tolerance itself, allowing captive women to maintain distorted versions of their original faiths, while ensuring those beliefs reinforced rather than challenged their subjugation. Christian women might be permitted to pray, but only to ask God to bless their Mongol masters and grant them patience in their servitude. Muslim women could observe religious holidays, but only while continuing to fulfill their duties as sexual property. This corrupted spirituality became perhaps the most insidious chain of all. Women who had once found strength in their faith now discovered that their gods seemed to demand submission to their captors. Religious leaders among the captives were either eliminated or converted into collaborators who preached acceptance of Mongol rule as divine will. Sacred texts were reinterpreted to justify the new order, with verses about suffering and endurance emphasized, while passages about justice and liberation were forgotten. The psychological profile of Mongol warriors reveals how thoroughly they had been conditioned to view this systematic exploitation as natural and necessary. From childhood, Mongol boys were taught that non-Mongol peoples represented a different category of being entirely closer to livestock than to humans in the cosmic hierarchy. This wasn't casual prejudice, but systematic indoctrination that made mass atrocities psychologically effortless for the perpetrators. A warrior who hesitated to claim his share of female captives faced ridicule and suspicion from his comrades. Such reluctance was interpreted as weakness or disloyalty that could compromise unit cohesion during future campaigns. The peer pressure to participate in sexual violence was overwhelming, creating a culture where brutality became a form of masculine performance and group bonding. The empire's legal scholars developed increasingly sophisticated justifications for these practices that drew from Mongol traditional law and conquered civilization's own legal precedents. They argued that resistance to Mongol rule constituted rebellion against the natural order established by Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Women who fought against their captivity were therefore criminals deserving punishment, while those who submitted gracefully demonstrated proper understanding of their place in the cosmic hierarchy. These legal frameworks weren't primitive rationalizations, but sophisticated jurisprudence that borrowed concepts from Chinese, Persian, and Islamic legal traditions. Mongol courts could cite precedents from multiple legal systems to justify the enslavement of any particular group, creating an intellectual edifice that made their practices appear legitimate to educated observers from conquered territories. The empire's diplomatic correspondence reveals how systematically these human trafficking operations were integrated into international relations. Mongol ambassadors regularly included captive women as gifts when negotiating with foreign powers, treating them as diplomatic currency alongside silk and precious metals. The recipients understood the message clearly. Cooperation brought valuable presents, while resistance brought devastation and enslavement. European chroniclers who witnessed these diplomatic exchanges struggled to comprehend the casual brutality underlying what appeared to be generous gift-giving. They recorded their shock at seeing princesses and noble ladies from recently conquered territories presented like exotic animals to foreign courts, their former status completely erased and replaced with their new identity as Mongol property. The training facilities that developed throughout the empire represented innovations in human conditioning that wouldn't be equaled until the 20th century. These installations combined elements of military barracks, educational institutions, and psychological laboratories in configurations designed to completely reprogram human behavior. New arrivals underwent systematic evaluation to determine their optimal role within the Mongol system, with different conditioning protocols applied based on their assessed potential. The most promising candidates for administrative positions received education in multiple languages, legal systems, and cultural practices that would make them effective intermediaries between Mongol administrators and subject populations. But this education came at the price of complete psychological transformation. They learned to see their former peoples through Mongol eyes, identifying weaknesses and resistance networks that could be exploited by their new masters. The physical modifications imposed on captive women served both practical and symbolic purposes that reinforced their new status. Hair was cut or styled according to Mongol preferences, often incorporating elements that marked them as property of specific individuals or military units. Clothing was standardized to prevent any expression of cultural identity or personal preference. In some cases, more permanent modifications were employed, including scarification or tattooing, that marked ownership in ways that couldn't be easily removed or disguised. The nutritional control exercised over captive populations demonstrated the Mongols' understanding of how hunger could be used as a conditioning tool. Food distribution was carefully calibrated to maintain health while creating constant awareness of dependency. Women who demonstrated compliance received better rations, while those who showed resistance faced systematic starvation that weakened both their physical capacity for rebellion and their psychological resistance to indoctrination. The Empire's record-keeping systems tracked the productivity and behavior of individual captives with remarkable precision. These files included detailed assessments of work capacity, reproductive history, psychological stability, and potential security risks. The data was used to optimize assignments and identify individuals who might be suitable for advancement within the slave hierarchy, or who posed threats that needed to be eliminated. The mobility of captive populations within the empire created a vast diaspora of displaced peoples, whose original cultures gradually dissolved under the pressure of constant relocation and cultural mixing. Women seized in one region might be transported thousands of miles to serve in completely different climatic and cultural environments, where their native skills and knowledge became irrelevant, and their connections to homeland were permanently severed. The children born from these systematic violations faced unique psychological challenges that the Mongols exploited with calculated precision. These mixed heritage offspring grew up knowing that their very existence testified to their mother's degradation and their father's conquest. Many developed profound identity disorders that made them dependent on Mongol approval for any sense of self-worth, creating a generation of natural collaborators who could never fully belong to either of the worlds that had created them. The empire's collapse during the 13th and 14th centuries didn't bring liberation to the millions of women who had been enslaved during its expansion. Instead, it scattered them across a fragmented landscape of successor states, each maintaining modified versions of the original Mongol system. The Golden Horde continued operating slave markets along the Volga River. The Ilkhanate maintained its human trafficking networks throughout Persia. The Yuan dynasty in China preserved its vast population of foreign concubines and servants. The institutional knowledge developed during the Mongol period proved remarkably durable, surviving the empire's political fragmentation and influencing human trafficking operations across Eurasia for centuries afterward. The techniques for psychological conditioning, the logistics of long-distance human transport, the legal frameworks justifying systematic exploitation, all became part of the standard toolkit employed by later regimes seeking to control and exploit subject populations. The biological legacy of Mongol sexual conquest continues to shape genetic patterns across Eurasia today, but the psychological and cultural damage proved even more enduring. The trauma inflicted on entire civilizations was embedded in folklore, cautionary tales, and collective memory that persisted long after the political structures that created it had crumbled into dust. The knowledge that such systematic dehumanization was possible fundamentally altered how these societies understood power, authority, and human nature itself. The Mongol approach to captive women represents one of history's most successful experiments in mass behavioral modification and cultural engineering. By combining physical coercion with psychological manipulation, economic incentives with ideological justification, they created a system that transformed victims into collaborators and resistance into compliance with terrifying efficiency. The the techniques they pioneered would be studied and refined by totalitarian regimes throughout subsequent centuries, proving that innovations in human cruelty possess a disturbing immortality that outlasts the empires that create them. Then, the systematic nature of Mongol human processing reached its most refined form in the empire's later decades, when administrative efficiency had transformed what began as military expedients into a continental industry of human commodification. By the time of Kublai Khan's reign, the mechanisms for capturing, conditioning, and distributing women had achieved a level of sophistication that rivaled the empire's famous postal system in its scope and reliability. The psychological conditioning programs developed during this period incorporated techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the emergence of modern totalitarian states. Mongol administrators had discovered that complete identity destruction required more than simple brutality. It demanded systematic replacement of every element that had once defined a person's sense of self. Memory itself became a target for elimination, with captives subjected to constant interrogation, designed not to extract information, but to force them to verbally renounce their former lives. Women were compelled to recite detailed confessions of their previous existence, describing their families, customs, and beliefs in language that portrayed them as primitive, shameful, and worthy of abandonment. These forced testimonials were repeated daily until the women began to internalize the narrative, gradually accepting the Mongol version of their own history as truth. The process was so thorough that many captives eventually experienced genuine gratitude toward their captors for rescuing them from what they had been taught to see as inferior circumstances. The empire's expansion into Southeast Asia and the Indonesian archipelago introduced new refinements to these techniques. The tropical climate and maritime geography presented unique challenges for transporting and housing large numbers of captives, leading to innovations in mobile processing facilities that could be established quickly in coastal areas before moving inland as conquest progressed. These temporary installations became testing grounds for accelerated conditioning methods that compressed months of psychological manipulation into weeks of intensive treatment. The naval operations required for these campaigns also created opportunities for what Mongol administrators termed maritime selection processes. Ships carrying captives across dangerous waters provided natural isolation that enhanced the effectiveness of conditioning programs. Women who had never been separated from land by more than a few miles suddenly found themselves completely cut off from any possibility of escape or rescue, their psychological vulnerability intensified by the alien environment of open ocean. The empire's encounter with more sophisticated urban civilizations in these regions led to the development of specialized processing protocols for educated women who possessed literacy and administrative skills. These captives represented particularly valuable assets whose conditioning required different approaches than those used for peasant women. They underwent elaborate re-education programs designed to preserve their technical abilities while completely reorienting their loyalty and cultural identity. The most intelligent of these women were eventually employed as instructors in the conditioning facilities, their intimate understanding of resistance psychology making them devastatingly effective at breaking down new arrivals. These collaborators developed techniques for identifying and exploiting the specific vulnerabilities of women from their own cultural backgrounds, creating customized approaches that could overcome resistance more efficiently than generic methods. The empire's religious incorporation policies reached their most sophisticated form during these later campaigns, with Mongol administrators developing what they called spiritual reprocessing techniques. Rather than simply suppressing conquered people's faiths, they learned to corrupt them from within, introducing doctrinal modifications that transformed religious belief into a tool of control. Sacred texts were reinterpreted to emphasize submission and suffering as paths to spiritual advancement, while traditional prayers were modified to include expressions of gratitude toward Mongol rulers. The economic dimensions of the slave trade evolved during this period, into complex financial instruments that integrated human trafficking with the empire's banking and credit systems. Captive women became collateral for international loans, with their assessed value backing transactions that spanned continents. This financialization created powerful incentives for continued expansion, as the entire economic system depended on a steady supply of fresh human assets to maintain liquidity and growth. The technological innovations that emerged from managing such vast numbers of captives included advances in restraint systems, transportation logistics, and crowd control methods that would influence military and civilian applications for centuries. Mongol engineers developed standardized shackling devices that could be mass-produced and deployed across the empire, along with modular housing systems that could be rapidly assembled to accommodate large groups of prisoners during processing and transport. The empire's communication networks adapted to include coded systems for tracking human cargo across vast distances, with relay stations maintaining detailed records of captive movements, condition assessments, and ownership transfers. These administrative innovations created an unprecedented level of bureaucratic control over human trafficking operations, ensuring that valuable assets couldn't be lost or misappropriated during the complex logistics of continental distribution. The cultural impact of these systematic practices extended far beyond the immediate victims to reshape entire civilizations' understanding of power, authority, and human nature. Societies that had survived Mongol conquest carried forward traumatic memories that influenced their political structures, social relationships, and cultural expressions for generations. The knowledge that such comprehensive dehumanization was possible fundamentally altered how these peoples approached questions of resistance, collaboration, and survival. The empire's legal scholarship during this period produced increasingly elaborate justifications for human trafficking that drew from multiple intellectual traditions to create comprehensive theoretical frameworks. These legal treatises weren't crude rationalizations, but sophisticated philosophical arguments that positioned Mongol practices within cosmic hierarchies and natural law theories that made systematic exploitation appear not merely acceptable, but morally necessary. The training programs for Mongol administrators evolved to include specialized education in human psychology and behavioral modification techniques that rivaled the sophistication of modern intelligence agencies. These officials learned to identify personality types, exploit psychological vulnerabilities, and implement conditioning protocols with scientific precision. Their expertise made the empire's human processing operations remarkably efficient, while minimizing the resources required for supervision and control. The demographic engineering projects undertaken during the empire's peak years created hybrid populations whose mixed heritage served Mongol strategic interests across multiple generations. Children born from these systematic breeding programs were carefully tracked and educated according to their intended roles within the imperial hierarchy, with their mixed bloodlines making them ideal intermediaries between Mongol administrators and subject populations. The empire's collapse didn't eliminate the institutional knowledge and technological capabilities that had made its human trafficking operations so effective. Instead, these innovations dispersed across Eurasia as former Mongol territories fragmented into independent states, each preserving elements of the original system while adapting them to local conditions and opportunities. The techniques pioneered during the Great Conquests became part of the standard toolkit employed by subsequent regimes seeking to control and exploit human populations. The shadows that fell across Eurasia during the Mongol conquests never truly lifted. 8 centuries later, we still live in a world shaped by the innovations in human cruelty that Genghis Khan and his successors perfected on the bodies of millions of captive women. The techniques they developed for systematic dehumanization, the administrative frameworks they created for processing human cargo, the psychological conditioning methods they pioneered, all became templates that later totalitarian regimes would study and refine. The DNA evidence scattered across continents tells only part of this story. The rest lives on in the collective memory of civilizations that learned what human beings are capable of when power meets absolute ruthlessness, and mercy becomes a luxury that conquerors can not afford.